You know, when you read through the New Testament, the idea of a big church that wasn't connected in small groups was unheard of. In fact, the idea of the church gathering like this in a big group was unheard of because they didn't have church buildings. And after they were persecuted in Acts chapter 2 and driven out of the temple area where they could gather with 3,000 people at a time, the early church was confined to house churches. And they met in house to house, it says, every day, breaking bread, listening to the apostles' teaching, praying together, sharing their goods together. So the real church in the New Testament is the small church, the house church, the group, the life on life, the relational church. And then whenever they could, they would gather as a large group. So don't mistake this for the real church. The real church is the people you know, the people you do life with in life groups. A couple other opportunities. One, Spring Hill Camp is coming to Oak Point this summer for 3 weeks, as well as to our Milford campus. Every year I ask you for money for scholarships, but I don't have to this year because you gave enough money last year for this year as well. So good job on that. But I do need to ask you for something. I need to ask you to roll up your sleeves and get involved. There's a kiosk out in the lobby. We need volunteers to help, to host, to maybe house one of the Spring Hill staff for a week, to have a dinner one evening, to come help with check-in, different things. Lots of opportunities, and we need a lot of volunteers. So there's a sign up out at the kiosk. Please volunteer to help us with that great outreach this summer. And then the Oak Point Bible degree, I guess you could say, with Moody, that certificate of completion that we're going to have 4 parts as we go through our 3-year journey here. The first part of that is coming to an end. It'll be on the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. There's a quiz in your bulletin on Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. Take it home. The answers are online on our website. That's to not only just test where you're at, but for those of you who've signed up for that class, that is a practice for your final exam, which will be toward the end of June. Now, the exams will be on the Blackboard, something called Blackboard. It's a website thing. You can check it out on our website. Go to oakpoint.org. You'll find Blackboard. But that's where you'll take your tests, you register, you get your syllabus to do the whole official thing. Next Sunday, between services, there'll be a tutorial on how to use the Blackboard if you're doing that. And I was told that this weekend's the last weekend to sign up officially for that first Bible course. And if those of you are here and you're wondering, what are you talking about? Well, we're going through the Bible, and we started about 10, 12 weeks ago. We're going through the whole Bible in 2.5 to 3 years, and we are in the first section of the Bible, the Pentateuch, the 5 scrolls, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and today we hit book number 4, the book of Numbers. And as I talk about Numbers today, I want to give this brief introduction, and then I'm going to pray for us. There's a section in Numbers, chapters 10 to 20, that is the most referred to portion of the Old Testament in the New Testament. New Testament writers refer to what we're going to see today, this one generation, and what happened to them in chapters 10 to 20 of Numbers more than any other as the prime example of what it means to walk with God or to fail to walk with God. And what we're going to see is this Exodus generation that came out of Egypt. Genesis is the book of beginnings. Exodus is the book of exit, where Israel came out of Egypt. What we're going to see is that generation failed to enter the promised land. It was a 15-day journey from Mount Sinai to the promised land. And they had the potential to be the great generation of the Old Testament, the generation that came out and was birthed as a nation, received God's laws, set up God's tabernacle, went on the journey, conquered the land, took the land of promise. They had the opportunity to be the great generation. And instead, they became the greatest example of a failed generation anywhere in the Bible. And the prime example, prime warning of how we can fail to get to the finish line because of certain things happening. So it's very important that we listen today. And here's the deal. Everybody in this room is on that journey. Everybody in the world is on a spiritual journey of some sort. Either we're far from God and we're asking questions, or we don't even believe in God. That's still part of the journey. Or we're right on the verge of saying, yes, I believe in God. I accept Jesus as my Savior. I'm going to move into the faith community. Or maybe we've been in a while. Maybe we're struggling. Maybe some of you are thinking about going back to Egypt and saying, I just don't like this discipleship thing. I don't like following Jesus. Maybe some of you today are facing challenges, giants. You're on the verge of the promised land, but the giants in the land are scaring you away, saying, God cannot handle my trial, my suffering, my difficulty. Everybody here is on a journey. And my sincere prayer this morning is that the journey that becomes the prime example in the New Testament will be a big example for us today, and that every one of us on our journey will take heed to what we need to do on our journey with God to make it to the finish line. Because ultimately in life, we're going to step across the finish line into eternity, and we're either going to hear one set of words or the other. Jesus said there's only two sets of words you're going to hear 1 second after you die. Either, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your master, welcome to the promised land. Or the other set of words, what were you thinking? Depart from me, you who practiced lawlessness and squandered away your life, your journey. So it's a really important weekend. And the way we end this weekend is going to be important. This is Tim and Tessa's last weekend with us. They're following God on a journey. And when we close today, we're going to do something with them and with you to decide whether you really want to follow God fully. And I'm going to ask for a commitment from you at the end of this service as we close in the final worship song. And it's going to be either, yes, I'm going to stand and follow, and I'm going to walk with God the best I can to the finish line, or no, I'm not sure. I'm going to call you to a commitment at the end of this service. So again, I just want to pray. I just want to ask God for his direction and blessing. God, speak to us as only you can through your word, through this passage. I can't give what only you can give. That is your spirit ministering your word to human hearts in a way that will change us forever. Only you can do that. And I pray you would do that right now. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so here's what happens. Genesis beginnings, Exodus, the exit out of Egypt. And at the end of Exodus, God makes his tabernacle in Israel's camp. And then Leviticus is the laws for the Levites, how to keep the holy God and the unholy people together through sacrifice, through offerings, through worship. Then the book of Numbers comes along, and the Greek name Numbers means counting. And that's because they counted the nation twice, once at the beginning of the book, once at the end of the book. And yet that's really not the most fitting name for the book. The Hebrew title for this book in the Hebrew canon is In the Wilderness. Now that's really the fitting title for this book, because what happens in Numbers is this generation that's about to take this joyous journey with God to the promised land ends up, it's a tragedy. They end up dying in the wilderness over 40 years because they would not trust God. The book of Numbers is about a journey toward the promised land turning into death in the desert. And it becomes a huge, huge warning and example. How did a 15-day journey turn into a 40-year nightmare where God said, I don't want any of you in that land. I want you dead in the desert. How do we get to that point where God says, I'm done, I'm finished, it's over? How do we get to that point? Well, the first 10 chapters of the book are preparing for the journey, and it's just like a family preparing to go on a vacation. It's counting the people. It's figuring out where everybody's going to sit in the van. It's figuring out what's going to be in the van and make sure you have all your provisions and who's going to carry what. And that's what the first 10 chapters is. It's preparations for the journey. And God assigns carrying duties for who's going to carry what in the tabernacle and where each camp is going to be in the march. And it's all very organized because we're going with God to the promised land. And the last thing that happens in chapter 9 is God boots up the navigation system. Because you need that when you go on a trip, right? You just type in your address, and then that's all you need, because the British lady will tell you from that point forward exactly how to get there, right? It's a navigation system, and we all use them. We use our phones, we use it, go, and they start talking, navigation. So God has a navigation system, and guess what? It was called the cloud. Believe it or not, it was called the cloud. And God thought of the cloud before anybody else thought of the cloud. God owns the patent on the cloud. And I'm not kidding. In chapter 9, here's what God said. Verse 15, now on the day that the tabernacle was erected, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of testimony. In the evening, it was like the appearance of fire over the tabernacle until morning. And whenever the cloud lifted over the tent, afterward the sons of Israel would set out. and in the place where the cloud settled down, there the sons of Israel would camp. At the command of the Lord, the sons of Israel would set out. At the command of the Lord, they would camp. So God would basically command them when to go where, and he did it through this cloud that would settle over the tabernacle. And basically the whole rule was just follow the cloud. That's all they had to do, follow the cloud. How difficult is that? 3 words, follow the cloud. All right, like if you're gonna take a trip across the country and the navigation system popped up and the lady just simply said, follow my voice. How difficult is that? It's not very difficult. So that's what they're supposed to do in the book of Numbers. Follow the cloud, because God, his presence, his voice, his directions, his protection, his provision is in that cloud for the journey. And so the day comes, 1 year, 2 months, 20 days into their stay at Mount Sinai. They've gotten all the laws, they got the tabernacle, they got the priesthood, they got everything for the journey. And on day 20 of month 2, year 2, it says this: the second year, the second month, the 20th of the month, the cloud, boom, lifted. And everybody must have just looked like, well, there it goes. Look, the cloud's up, it's starting to move. And that's exactly what they did. The cloud lifted from over the tabernacle of testimony, and the sons of Israel packed their bags and set out on the journeys from the wilderness of Sinai. And you got one big happy family, 2 million people on a journey toward the promised land with one simple phrase in their mind: follow the cloud. That's it. That's all they got to do. Follow the cloud. How difficult is that? Well, pretty difficult. Because just like Chevy Chase in his great family vacation movies, it turns into chaos. Nobody wants to play by the rules. Nobody wants to follow the cloud. Instead, it's follow the crowd. It's follow the inner voices. It's follow our desires. It's follow the naysayers. It's follow those who have no faith. It's follow our desires back to Egypt. It's follow our memories. Follow our fears. What happens is this journey toward the promised land becomes disaster because they won't follow the cloud. They'll follow anything but the cloud. They will not follow and heed and hear God's voice, and ultimately it's going to turn into a great tragedy. And that's what happens in chapters 11 through 20, this period where time and time again, and God says 10 times you've tested me here in the wilderness, 10 times. And the repetition of the failure in chapters 11 through 20 is just striking. And so what I want to do for the next few minutes is just walk you through these events, because that's what God does. It's through the repetition of their failure. And I want you to see yourself in some of these events, because some of them involve grumbling. Some of them involve a lack of faith that God's big enough. Some of them involve wanting to follow the crowd back to some other kind of pleasure in life. Some of them involve not believing God is really good, and that instead of blessing you, he's actually going to hurt you. They involve all these different things, and I want you to see your own journey in light of these. So we're going to walk through them very quickly, and then we're going to close in a unique sort of way. So the very first day of the journey, the very first trip is 3 days, actually, from Mount Sinai north toward the Promised Land. It's a total 15-day journey. That's all it is. So the first little 3-day journey, what do? They begin to complain. So it says, soon the people began to complain about their hardship. And the Lord heard everything they said. We don't like this. This is too hard. Wow, 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 wow. We don't like this trip. When can we stop? When are we there? I don't like my seat on the bus. I don't like this. I just don't like this. And the Lord's anger blazed against them. And here's the first thing that happens. He sends a fire to rage among them and destroyed some of the people in the outskirts of the camp. Then the people screamed to Moses for help, and he prayed to the Lord, and the fire stopped. After that, they named that place Taberah, which means we got burned. We got burned because fire from the Lord had burned among them. So there's the first leg of the trip. The people get burned because they're complaining so much at God that the fire breaks out and God destroys a whole bunch of them on the outskirts of the camp. That's like crazy. It's like Chevy Chase with his family in the van, and the first gas station they stop at, the van catches on fire and burns up, and they got to start all over again. So they name the first day, we got burned. That's how it starts. Then it gets worse, because right after that, they start complaining about the food. They start complaining about the food. In particular, their complaint is, where's the beef? Where is the beef? Then it says the foreigners who were traveling with the Israelites, and those are people who were in Egypt but who weren't Jewish,
But when they saw the plagues and they saw the Passover and they saw the Exodus, they came out with the Jews and they're headed toward the promised land as foreigners. But when they're traveling with the Israelites, they began to crave the good things of Egypt. And now the people of Israel began to complain. What's Israel doing? They're following the crowd instead of the cloud. Oh, for some meat, they exclaimed. We remember the fish we used to eat for free in Egypt. We had all the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, garlic we wanted. But now our appetites are gone, and all we ever see is this manna, this bread that falls every day. They're disgruntled. They're eating this manna. Now, remind you, this is just a short journey. It's only 15 days that they've got to eat some bread. It's not like they got to do this for 40 years. It's a short little journey, but they are so discontented, and they're so grumbling, and so believing that God is not good, and so linked to the past that they're building up the past better than it really was. I mean, they were slaves back there in Egypt. But now it's like, oh, remember the garlic and the cucumber sandwiches and the fish and all of that? Now they're listening to the voice of the past, and Israel's falling into it. Well, God says, okay, you want meat, I'll give you meat. And God causes this flock of quail to come over the camp of Israel and fall dead in the camp, 3 feet deep, it says, all the way around the camp. God says, I'll give you quail. They ate quail for 2 months, it says, until it was coming out of their nostrils. They were so sick of meat. Stop the meat, please stop the meat. But God is judging them because of their complaining. The trip is not going well. Third thing that happens is Moses says, God, could you do me a favor and kill me? Just kill me. I don't want to do this trip anymore. Just take me home. Let them do the trip with somebody else. Seriously, Moses says, kill me now. Moses was very aggravated. We're early in the trip, we're like at the second stop. And Moses said to the Lord, listen to this string of questions. This shows his humanity. Why are you treating me like this? Why are you treating your servant so harshly? Have mercy on me. What did I do to deserve the burden of all these people? Did I give birth to them? Did I bring them into the world? Why did you tell me to carry them in my arms like a mother carries a nursing baby? How can I carry them to the land you swore to give their ancestors? Where am I supposed to get meat for all these people? They keep whining to me saying, give me meat to eat. I can't carry all these people by myself. The load is far too heavy. If this is how you're going to treat me, go ahead, kill me. Do me a favor, spare me the misery. That's your great man of God there. Spare me the misery. In fact, he says in Hebrew, it says, spare me from seeing my own wretchedness. He's saying to God, I'm becoming something that I don't even want to look in the mirror at. I don't want to see how bad I'm going to get. So kill me before I become the monster I'm becoming. And God says, no, I'm not finished with you yet. I'm not going to kill you. So instead of judging Moses like he's been judging the congregation with quail coming out their nose or fire, he gives Moses help. He gives him 70 leaders who are qualified, who have the same spirit he has, 70 leaders to come alongside and help. So he sees how his servant is struggling. And by the way, I just am encouraged by the reality of Moses' heart, by the emotional struggle it was to lead, and by God's grace toward him, and God giving him the help he needed. But in spite of that, the fourth disaster that happens is 2 people in the back seat say, let us drive because you do not know how to lead this ship at all. And those 2 people are the closest people to Moses there could be, his brother and sister, Miriam and Aaron. His 14-year-old older sister and his 3 years older brother said, get out of the way. You do not know what you're doing. We need to drive. That's the next problem. In chapter 12, while they were at Hazeroth, Miriam and Aaron criticized Moses because he'd married a Cushite woman, an Egyptian wife. Apparently, it's been about 42 years since he married Zipporah. Scholars believe Zipporah had died, his first wife, and so he'd married an Egyptian woman, and they're complaining about that, but that's a smokescreen because that's not really what they're mad about. Here's what they're really mad about. They said, has the Lord spoken only through you, Moses? Hasn't he spoken through us too? In other words, who do you think you are making all the decisions and leading in this way? Do you think you have some special deal with God? It's really interesting, this chapter. It's one of the only chapters where Moses never said a word. Because what happens is God just comes down right there on the spot and he stands between Moses and Aaron and Miriam and he immediately strikes Miriam with leprosy. She becomes white as snow and she's confined outside the camp for 7 days in judgment from God while the Israelites wait. And Moses never said a word because what God did is he just stood between the opposition. and made the decision. But the point is, look what's happening. Everybody's rebelling. The people are rebelling. The foreigners are rebelling. The people are asking for food. Moses is tiring. His brother and sister are giving up, questioning his leadership. This is a disastrous journey. So finally, they make it from down here on Mount Sinai, the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula, to the Mount of Horeb, Mount Sinai. They make it up to the edge of the Promised Land to a place called Kadesh Barnea. And now they're ready to go in. So in spite of everything that's happened, God's still ready to lead them in. And God says, I want you to send in 12 spies to check out this great land I'm giving you. Pick one guy from every tribe and send them in. So they send the 12 spies in, and the spies look at the land, they see how great it is, all this stuff, and then they come back with a report. And the report that 10 of the spies give is basically this: what were we thinking? What were we thinking that we could ever go in there? What got into our head that we thought we could ever take that land? They come back and they give this report: we cannot go up against them. They are stronger than we are. Never mind God. Never mind the God who brought us out of Egypt, the God of the Exodus, the God of the Passover, the God of the Red Sea, the God who's been feeding us, the God who can bring quail this deep even though it's coming out of our nose. Never mind the God. We can't go up against them. So they spread this bad report about the land to the Israelites. The land we have traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. And all the people we saw there are huge. We saw giants there, the descendants of Anak, and next to them, we were grasshoppers, and that's what they thought too. That's called grasshopper mentality. Their giants were grasshoppers. Never mind God. And they spread this report to the crowd. 10 spies say no, 2 say go. Joshua and Caleb said, we can do this. We believe God's bigger than our giants. But what is the congregation going to do now? Are they going to listen to the voice of God? Or are they going to follow the cloud or follow the crowd? Are they going to follow the 10? Or what are they going to do? They decide that there's no way they can go. They're going to follow the voice of these 10 naysayers who do not have a view of God big enough to go forward. And so D-Day comes, and they all decide we're going back to Egypt. Forget about Moses, forget about Miriam, forget about Aaron, forget about the navigation system, forget about the cloud. We're going with the crowd, we're going with the 10, we're going home to Egypt. Then it says the whole community began weeping aloud. They cried all night. What are they crying about? Well, here's what they're crying about. Their voices rose in great chorus of protest against Moses and Aaron. If only we had died in Egypt, or even here in the wilderness, they complain. Why is the Lord taking us to this country only to have us die in battle? We're going to die. God's taking us to die. Wait a minute. Don't we remember Genesis 12? I'm going to give you a great land. I'm going to give you a great name, a great blessing. I'm going to make you a great nation. What about the promise of God? Well, chuck the promise of God. It doesn't matter. We're going to die. That's what's going to happen. They're believing these spies. They're believing their own gut. Our wives and our little ones are going to be carried off as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to get back to Egypt? Then they plotted and said, let's choose a new leader to go back to Egypt. And this is really D-Day, chapter 14, Kadesh Barnea. It's the turning point of this Old Testament journey because it's right here on the edge. If this is the Sinai Peninsula and that's the promised land, they're right here, right there to go in. And God says, recalculating. The navigation system just starts blinking, recalculating, and they're like, what's going on? And the little British lady comes on and says, I would like you to turn left, and then turn left again, and then turn left again, and then turn left again, and keep turning left for the next 40 years until you all drop dead. That's what the navigation system says. Go in circles for the next 40 years because I'm done. And they're like, what? Oh, seriously. Here's what it says. Chapter 14, God says, surely all the men who've seen my glory and my signs, which I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet you've put me to the test these 10 times, and underline this, highlight it, do something with it, because this is the key, and have not listened to my voice. They shall by no means see the land which I swore to their fathers, the land which I swore. The promises I made, they will not see those promises fulfilled because they would not listen to my voice, nor shall any of those who spurn me see it. They would not listen to his voice. The navigation system said, go. The cloud said, go. I'll be with you. I'll take you in. We'll be fine. Follow the cloud. No, not listening to that voice anymore. Turn it off. We're going our own way. I'm going to listen to the voice of the crowd, my fears, my heart, my sin nature, the foreigners, the memories, the obstacles. I'm listening to the voice of the giants who told me I'm a grasshopper. That must be true. I'm a grasshopper, right? I'm not a child of the king. I'm a grasshopper. So I'm following that. And there's the key to their failure. It's the voices they chose to listen to other than God. And we're going to see that in the New Testament when they quote this section. The key line is they would not listen to God's voice. So the question today becomes, what voices are you listening to on your journey? And that determines everything. What are you listening to? Are you listening to the crowd that says, come on, let's go this way with life? Are you listening to the expectations of what everybody else does in life that seems normal? You know, well, I went to college, I graduated. I guess you're supposed to just get a good job and just make money and live and get a house. And isn't that what you're just supposed to do? The voice of expediency, the voice of normalcy? Are you listening to the voice of fear that says, oh, there's no way I can do that? I mean, how could I possibly do that? Take God out of the equation. I can't do that. I'm a grasshopper. What voices are you listening to? Are you listening to the voice of the past that says, wow, it was way better back there before I started following Jesus. I think I'm going to go back to before. I'm going back. Well, who are you listening to? What are you listening to? Because that determines everything in the journey. Are you following the cloud or are you following some other set of voices? That's going to determine everything. So what happens next is that the leadership revolts and says, no way are we going to circle forever till we die. No way is that going to happen to us. Korah, a priest, along with 250 other dignified leaders of the community, all prominent members of the assembly, at this point, they united against Moses and Aaron and said, you have gone too far. Like the circling thing till we're dead, it's your problem. This is your idea. You've gone too far. The whole community of Israel has been set apart by the Lord, and he's with all of us. What right do you have to act as though you are greater than the rest of the Lord's people? And at that point, God just says to Moses, tell the congregation to move away from the tents of all 250 of these leaders. Get away from their cars, their tents, their toys, their boats, their Hot Wheels, their kids, their wives, everything. Get away from their golf clubs and their lawnmowers because they're about to go down. So everybody just backs up and all of a sudden an earthquake happens and the earth opens up and swallows all of these people. Dead, gone, just like that. Because of the rebellion against God's command, you're going to circle here till you're dead. And it's bad. This journey is bad. It just goes from bad to worse. And you think the rest of the congregation that just saw that happen, I mean, if you saw that happen, what would you do the next day? Wouldn't you fear God a little bit, like and say, I better not rebel against God. I better check my spirit here. The next day, the whole congregation rebels against Moses again and says, the death of those guys is your fault too. The very next morning, the whole community of Israel began muttering against Moses and Aaron, saying, you killed those people yesterday. That's your fault too. And then as the community gathered to protest against Moses and Aaron, they turned toward the tabernacle, and all of a sudden the cloud covered it again, and the glorious presence of the Lord appeared. The cloud just sort of lit up, and you kind of just get this sober feeling like, oh no, something's going to happen here. God's about to show up. And sure enough, God strikes the whole congregation with a plague, and 14,700 people died before Moses took his stand between those who were dying and those who were living and interceded, and God checked the plague through his authorized agent, Moses. He checked the plague. It's a bad journey. It's a bad stretch. It's a bad story. And you just think about what they could have been. They could have been the great generation. They could have been the generation that the whole New Testament wrote about, like these people of faith who saw God's greatness and his glory and his power, And even though things got tough, they persevered because they believed God was good. And even though the giants were big, they persevered because their God was bigger. And even though they ran out of water, they didn't grumble or complain because they said, God's going to give us water eventually. And even though they were just eating bread, they're just like, okay, well, the bread will be fine for 15 days. I'm sure we'll have meat when we get to the promised land. But instead of that, instead of being the great generation, they became the great disaster generation, because they simply could not follow the cloud and listen to God's voice. And all these other voices got their attention, and they followed all those voices right into death in the desert. It's a tragic story. And the most tragic part of it, I guess, is chapter 20, which is the obituary column of Numbers. In fact, it's the obituary column of the entire Bible. Because in the beginning of Numbers 20, Miriam dies, and they bury her in the desert. And at the end of Numbers 20, Aaron dies, and they bury him in the desert. And in the middle of the chapter, Moses' dream dies. Moses' dream to lead the people into the promised land dies because he decides in one moment to not listen to God's voice. And this is staggering, but it all comes down to what voice are you listening to? And here's how it happens. The people were grumbling one more time. They're grumbling for water, and they're grumbling for meat, and they're grumbling for something. And here's what happens, and it starts off good. Moses and Aaron, they go before the Lord in the tent of meeting, and the Lord says to Moses, here's God's voice, okay? You and Aaron must take the staff and assemble the entire community. And remember the staff that Aaron and Moses used to lead Israel out of Egypt? The staff, it had like this power to strike the Nile and it would become blood, and to strike the Red Sea and it would part, and to strike the air and it would become locusts. So, it was a symbol of God's power. So take the staff and have the people assemble, and here's God's voice again. As the people watch, speak to the rock over there, and it will pour out its water. And you'll provide enough water from the rock to satisfy the whole community and their livestock. So God says, his voice is, take the staff, but don't use it. Now this had happened before, and God's command was, strike the rock. And he did. He struck the rock with the staff, and water gushed out and watered the whole community. But this time God says, take the staff, but instead of striking the rock, I want you to speak to the rock, because I want to demonstrate my grace to the congregation. I want to demonstrate my forgiveness for their grumbling again. I want a specific demonstration from you. And it's not harshness and rash. It's just grace. So Moses did as he was told. He took the staff from the place where it was kept before the Lord, and then he and Aaron summoned the people to come and gather at the rock. And then he shouted, listen, you rebels, do you want water from the rock? I'll give you water from the rock. Then Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with the staff. Just like that. And what did God do? Water gushed forth from the rock, and God graciously watered the whole congregation and all of their cows. And then he had a little talk with Moses. And this is shocking. He had a little talk. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust me enough to demonstrate my holiness to the people, you will not lead them into the land I'm giving them. This place was known as the waters of Meribah, which means arguing or contention, because there the people of Israel argued with the Lord, and there he demonstrated his holiness among them. Moses lost his dream right there on the spot. And if you go through the rest of Numbers and Deuteronomy, he pleaded with God several times. Please revoke that punishment. I want to take them in. It's been everything I've lived for since day one. I was born for this. I've been trained for this. I've been looking for this. I've led them for 40 years out here. I want to lead them in. God finally said, stop talking to me about this. You will not lead them in because you did not treat me as holy in the sight of the people. You see, the problem with Moses' sin is 2 million sets of eyes were watching, and they'd all gotten the memo about what Moses and Aaron were supposed to do. They all got the memo that Moses was to talk to the rock on their behalf, and they all knew he had rebelled against God.
And when a leader falls like that, with 2 million sets of eyes are watching, the stakes are high. It's called the law of the leader. It doesn't matter if you're leading a group, you're a shepherd for some high school kids or junior high kids, or you're leading a Spring Hill group. When you step into the leadership position, the stakes are higher. If any ordinary Israelite had gone into their tent that day and gotten a little ticked off at all the hardship and kicked the tent, God wouldn't have taken away their life dream to go into the promised land. But Moses was a leader. And Moses was frustrated. And you can say, well, look how frustrated he was. Sure, he has a right to be frustrated. Yeah, but his emotions took over and overrode God's voice. And his voice that said, you know what? You have a right to give these people a little talking to right now. That's the voice he listened to in that moment. And that voice, instead of follow the cloud, he followed his inner anger and lost a life dream. It's a sobering, sobering, sobering story. And the message is, no matter who we are on this journey, it doesn't matter if it's you or it's me or who it is, every one of us can suffer the death of a dream if we listen to the wrong voice. And so when you come to the New Testament writer, Paul, in 1 Corinthians 10, picks this up and he makes a whole chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians, and he says, look at these people, Corinthians, they fell in the desert. They were on a race, like we're on a race. Paul uses the analogy of a race and getting to the finish line and winning the prize. And then he says, but this generation ran the race, but then sin took them out, grumbling took them out, idolatry took them out. It took them out, and they never made it to the finish line. And Paul pleads with the Corinthians, run the race, but beware that sin and these other voices can take you out. Beware, run, but beware. And when you're tempted, God will provide a way of escape if you look for it. Walk humbly before him, and when you see temptation, look for the exit door, because there's a race here. There's something at stake, and he pleads with them not to fall into the trap of this generation. But the one I want to focus on as we close is book of Hebrews, chapter 3 and 4. And the anonymous writer of the book of Hebrews is talking to a group of Christians, professing Christians, who are living under the persecution of the Roman Empire, the heat of the Roman Empire. We don't like this life as Christians. We're getting persecuted. We don't like this manna. We don't like this heat. We don't like this desert. We don't like not having jobs. We remember how it was before we were Christians. We want to go back to Egypt and eat our garlic and melons. That's what this early group of professing Christians was doing. And the writer says to them 3 times, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as they did at Meribah in the wilderness. 3 times he says it in chapter 3 and 4. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. And he makes this argument in chapter 3 and 4 about how there is a rest waiting for the people of God, almost like a promised land, that God's plan A for our lives is right here, his rest, his promise, it's here. And we're trying to get there. But if you stop listening to his voice and harden your heart, you'll miss the rest that God has for your life, that plan A. And you'll live some other life, plan B, C, D, but it amounts to death in the desert. And the writer is saying to these people, hold on. Hold on to your confidence, firm it to the end. Hold on to the boast of your hope, firm it to the end. Hang in there, keep listening to his voice. Don't harden your heart. And as we close today, I guess what I want to say, or what I hope God wants to say is, every one of you is on a journey. But that journey of life with God, Ephesians 2:10, we are his work of art, created in Christ for good works, which God has prepared beforehand for us to walk in. God has a whole life for you, a set of good works, things he wants to do. Things he wants to challenge in you, things he wants to grow in you, things he wants to do in the world through you that are bigger than you enjoying garlic and melons and little meat. It's bigger than that. It's life with God being used for his purposes. Acts 13:36, David served God's purpose in his generation, and then he fell asleep and was laid to rest among his fathers. You only get one shot at this, folks. One journey this ship makes. And at the end, it's over, and it's your generation, it's your journey. And there's only 2 options. Either you live with God at the fore, and his voice is your primary voice, and you follow the cloud,
And whatever that plays out, that's God's best for you. Or you follow the crowd, you follow your inner voice, you follow the past, you follow your fears, you follow everybody else. And whatever it is, I guarantee you, however it looks, God's gonna write death in the desert over that. It's only two options. And my passion for you as we close is to call you to that life of following the cloud again. And I need it, and you need it. And asking right now, who am I listening to? What voice am I listening to, really, to make the decisions about my life? God still speaks through his word, through the community, through godly counsel, through convictions, through people coming to you, exhorting you, reproving you, correcting you, through your emotions, through your own fears. God's talking, and he's saying, you gonna follow me or not?